Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Clinical Supervision Echo. We're at top of the hour, so we'll go ahead and dive in. Thank you all for being here. As you all know, we're a virtual community of practice, meeting monthly. I'm Olivia Shadid. I'm a child and adult psychiatrist with UNM, and I'll be our facilitator today. Our goal really with this ECHO is to create a community of practice for supervisors in behavioral health throughout the state of New Mexico. So this forum is really a discussion about best practices in supervision, and it's based on the state of New Mexico's clinical supervision implementation guide. I'll put that link in the chat. So in case folks haven't been able to look through that, that's really what we're rounding this series in. And we're so lucky to have multiple creators of the guide as part of our hub team. So a reminder to please turn and keep your cameras on if possible. Really helps us to interact as people instead of little boxes. So nice for presenters in particular to get to see faces. Our agenda is pretty simple and straightforward. We're going to have a lecture, a didactic portion, followed by a case discussion. And the case discussion is always an issue related to supervision in behavioral health. After our hour-long session, we will have about 10 minutes after where folks want to join in and ask the presenter any more questions or share about some of the work that they're doing, hear about the work of colleagues. It's an opportunity for us to get to know each other and the work that we're doing a little bit more. So we'll start with introductions just briefly. And we'll start with our UNM tech support. Raina, if you could unmute and say hi.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Reina Torres, Program Coordinator for our ECHO. I'll be here on the back end if you need any tech support and need any help with your CEs.
Awesome. Thank you, Raina. And then we have our hub team. And so maybe we can sort of popcorn around to each other, maybe starting with Brenda. Say hi.
Hello, everyone. I'm Brenda Quiñones Cortez. I lead El Puente de Encuentros, a nonprofit that's supporting BIPOC students entering the mental and behavioral health field. And I will then hand it over to Jen.
Jen Panhorst, LCSW. I am the interim director of UNM's Masters of Social Work program that is in development. And I don't know that I know you're going to introduce Denise. I think we're kind of light attendance on the hub team today.
Yeah, I think you're right. Thank you, Jen. Well, I'll go ahead and introduce our presenter, who is also one of our hub team members. Denise Moore, LPCC, is a professional clinical mental health counselor in the state of New Mexico and a certified clinical trauma professional through the International Association of Trauma Professionals. She additionally holds a credential for approved clinical supervision through the National Board of Certified Counselors. She holds a Bachelor of Arts in Latin American Studies from Oberlin College and a Master's of Arts in Counseling from Southwestern College. She's currently a doctoral student at Southwestern College as well. Denise has extensive experience working with survivors of violence and incorporating trauma-informed practices in both therapy and supervision. She's been teaching for over 15 years, with 5 years at the graduate level in counseling education programs. Her clinical experience spans working with families and children in a home-based program to working with complex trauma in both short-term and long-term treatment with individuals. She's trained in various evidence-based practices, including DBT, EMDR, CBT, and motivational interviewing, among other therapeutic techniques. Denise was born and raised in Santa Fe and feels passionate about providing quality and equitable mental health services to the community she loves. She is bilingual in English and Spanish. Thank you so much, Denise, for sharing your expertise today. We'll hand it over to you for the didactic presentation.
Thank you, Olivia. Hello, everyone. I'm excited to talk to you today about trauma-informed clinical supervision. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that we can get those slides up for you all. All right, and just let me know if you guys can see that. You guys can see my other screen. Let me try that again. Of course, that's what happens when we practice and then the practice doesn't work. All right, let's try this.
It's
And-
loading, looks perfect.
There we go. All right. So we're going to talk about trauma-informed clinical supervision today. I just want to let you know that I am not receiving any financial agreement or arrangement for this activity today. So disclosure statement. What I am discussing here today are my views and not necessarily part of UNM's. So just making that disclaimer as well. And here's what the more important part of the presentation is, for me at least, talking about our learning objectives. So today in our very brief presentation, this could be a full day workshop. It could be several series of workshops. This is an introduction to trauma-informed supervision, and just covering some overviews that I think are important to remember as clinicians, but more importantly as supervisors. So we're going to identify and explain some trauma-informed principles. This will probably be review for many of you. And just to remind you of some of those principles, we're going to look at how trauma histories can influence and impact our supervisees and our clinical teams in general. And then kind of throughout, we're going to talk about potential reflective supervision techniques to support supervisees to mitigate secondary or vicarious trauma, which we know is part of the work that when we're working with folks who have trauma. So part of what it means to be trauma-informed, and this was some things that I took away in my training as a trauma-informed therapist, is first knowing about our community, knowing the community that we're serving, and learning how the specific realities of our clients impact our clinicians, but also knowing the environments in which our clinicians are coming through. Understanding the effects of trauma on the brain and the body is important as clinicians, and also to track for our supervisees. We have the opportunity to work, many of us, if we're lucky, in that one-on-one supervision to get to know our supervisees in a very more like maybe intimate way than we do maybe group supervision, and knowing how our supervisees show up and is an important way. Understanding the prevalence of trauma for our supervisees and supervisors, but for our supervisees, like how if our clients are coming from trauma histories, we can assume that many of our clinicians are also coming from these trauma histories. And so how do we support our clinicians in helping our community? And then learning our approaches. So how do we help mitigate some of that secondary trauma? So I'm going to share some stats, and there are many stats out there to kind of understand our communities and understand prevalence of trauma in our communities. And this is a relatively old stat because I still think they're collecting data from the pandemic and on. And so it would be interesting to see how these stats shift from those larger kind of traumatic experiences we've had in the past 5 years. But this statistic from 2019 talks about the ACEs, which are the adverse childhood experiences. And many of us are familiar with those. If you're not, it's a questionnaire, 10 questions that kind of couch early childhood experiences that then adults report on later on in life. And so this is a stat for New Mexico. And what we can see here is that the 4 or more category, this in ACEs, is where we acknowledge that there's potential for more problematic, physical health issues later in life, more occurrences of substance use. So this number, the 4 or more, is where we see more challenges for community members, more challenges for folks in our community. And we can see here that almost a quarter in 2019 reported 4 or more ACEs. This is important to talk about with our supervisees, that this is the population with which they're most likely going to work with in the state of New Mexico. But it's also important for us as supervisors to remember that our supervisees come from these statistics as well. And so how do we support our supervisees, knowing that we're asking them to do these hard things and knowing that they may also be part of this population as well? So that to me is what it means to be trauma informed, is not only that we know how to work with trauma, but understanding that trauma is within our space, it's within our supervision, it's within our clinical meetings. And how do we support those especially emerging therapists who may not want or know or have the experience of navigating some of those trickier things that happen within those relationships. Some things to remember in trauma-informed supervision. This comes from SAMHSA's trauma-informed care model, understanding what we know about trauma. And so SAMHSA loves their acronyms and their quick things, right? So we got our 3 E's and our 4 R's. And remembering this when we're teaching our supervisees about trauma-informed care. This is a nice one that we use at our clinic just to remember, like, when we're thinking about trauma, we're thinking really about an event and experience and the effect. And the effect is going to be different on everyone. And then as practitioners, how are we responding? Well, we want to understand and hold the realization of the trauma. We want to respond and we want to resist re-traumatizing. I think this is true when we're working in supervision. And I was actually talking to a colleague this morning about how this idea of re-traumatization is important when we're in large groups and doing clinical team meetings, for example. Like, how much trauma do we want an individual to share in a case presentation? And so having good boundaries with that within our clinics, within our organizations and our supervision. What is relevant and what is re-traumatizing, I think, is really important to remember. And so we talk about the difference between debriefing and a case presentation, right? If you want to debrief something, there's a one-on-one opportunity in supervision. If we're doing case presentations and there's 15, 20 clinicians in the room, how much of the trauma do we want to share? How much of that, we call it a trauma dump, right? How much of that do we want to trickle out into a group? And because we don't know everybody's 3 E's on trauma, we don't know everybody's events, experience, and effect of trauma. We don't know exactly what's going to happen in those clinical team meetings or case presentations if we just allow people to just talk about specific details. So I like these to remember for myself as a supervisor, and also to work with supervisees. And I think that's what's nice about being a trauma-informed therapist, is we can do both. We can show our supervisees how to be trauma-informed, and we can hold those concepts in our supervision. So something that is interesting now in working in this field of trauma is this idea of understanding what trauma is, but also really couching and understanding what a parallel process is. And I think when I was starting out as a therapist, parallel process felt very separate. Like the stuff that my clients were working on in therapy, I might have experienced years ago. I think the pandemic changed that for me as a clinician, where now we're going through this worldly crisis at the same time. And so I think emerging clinicians are confronted far more with challenges of parallel process because of the world that we're in right now. And I don't think the two can be divorced. So I think we have to talk about parallel process and clinical supervision. And I think we need to talk about what countertransference looks like in our supervision. And being trauma-informed supervisors means understanding and knowing the breadth of what trauma is happening outside of our clinical agencies, walls, et cetera. It is difficult because we have to balance. We're not our supervisees therapists. And so knowing those boundaries as well, like, when does this become you got to talk to your therapist about this, or do you have a therapist and should we maybe look one up together? Because those lines also can get blurred. Another piece about trauma-informed supervision that I like to kind of bring with my supervisees and just into this conversation today is really knowing how dysregulation can show up with our supervisees. And it can be different for everyone. And the more we learn about our supervisees and the more relationship we have with our supervisees, there's people that I've been working with for a couple years now, and I can kind of sense when they're dysregulated at this point. But new emerging therapists may not want to talk about this with you, or may not want to show like they want to be really competent and they want to show that they can do it. And that's all important. And how do we have that conversation? So if you're feeling dysregulated, what might be something that we do together? Do we need to do a grounding before we start our supervision? If there's a time when you do need to debrief, what are some things that help you become more regulated? And again, that becomes more of a relational thing and less intervention type, more of that might cross into that therapy place. So having these conversations about what supports a student, an emerging therapist, a supervisee, can be helpful, and normalize it. It can happen. You will at some point in your career have a session that is dysregulating. And so how do we talk about that together? And how are some things that we can do to support you? And I think that normalization is really key for emerging therapists. Because ultimately what we are trying to do is we're trying to create a trust, a safe and trust-based relationship where vulnerability can happen, where a supervisee can come and express concerns, can come and talk about what's happening with them. We want our supervisees to tell us when they're having countertransference, right? Because that's how we can support them. And if there's fear that there's going to be, any kind of judgment, or any type of unsupportive environment, that can make it harder for the supervisee to come. So again, this comes from trauma-informed approach from SAMHSA. I like this as a framework. And again, it's just one of many frameworks and a very kind of basic standard slide, really, to help us couch into, well, how do we do this? How do we build safety? And I think having those guidelines. What does trustworthiness and transparency look like, right? And one of the key tenets of trauma-informed is providing choice and providing information. So making sure we're having those conversations with supervisees. And again, that's that reflective practice of supervision. Well, what would work for you? Or here are some choices. We could, have a regular check-in after this client that feels really triggering for you. And we can have maybe, a regular extra supervision on the weeks that you have this other client that has been really challenging. Or maybe there's some choice of, maybe this isn't the right client for you. Maybe there's too much going on in your life right now that we need to have someone else take this case. Or maybe there's training that we can provide and support. And again, that ability to provide moments of collaboration, empowerment, and choice, I think, is what makes a good, one, in general, supervision relationship, but also what makes us trauma-informed. One thing that I like to tell my supervisees when we are trauma-informed, it's not necessarily what we do, it's how we do it. And so sometimes we have to have those hard conversations with our supervisees because it's not a good match, because the countertransference is too great, or because there's concerns and ethical reasons. But how do we do that in a way that the supervisee is learning from it and maybe getting some support around whatever issues might be coming up. Another part of trauma-informed supervision that I like to do as well is really helping the supervisee understand the body and the brain and the response that is happening. I think when I think of myself, when I was starting as a therapist, it was really easy for me to kind of see it outside of myself, like, oh, I can see this happening to my client, right? And then the part of me happening to me was like, why am I feeling anxious? Why am I having a hard time focusing? And so really bringing it back, like, yes, it's both and. We're also humans. We have a body, brain, and a response. And really remembering to share with our supervisees that ultimately trauma has an impact. And even if we, in our own, trauma histories, don't have a specific thing coming up in therapy, hearing traumas over and over and over again does. And we can't ignore that. And so making sure that we have the ability to say, well, how are you doing? How are things going? In our clinical meetings, we try to have some sort of check-in, some sort of grounding, some sort of opening, because we know that we're about to talk about cases, and it's good to have a container. And so if you have a population that you work with that has a lot of trauma, or that that your supervisees are seeing a lot of trauma, sometimes those rituals and practices of like, well, let's get grounded before we start diving into cases. Or is there something you need before we go into supervision? I have a supervisee that will run in here and be kind of chaotic, and it's like, okay, well, let's put our feet on the ground. I'll do it with you. And let's do it together, and let's just notice what's happening. And so those relational impacts are I think, key in helping our supervisees. So we go back to the 3 E's, and I come back to this because when we think about clinicians and new clinicians and emerging clinicians, and also this context that we're in now, and in parallel process, and what's happening in the world, and I think therapists entering the world now is very different from 15 years ago when I entered clinical practice. And I often tell them, I think clinicians coming into the field now are probably the bravest folks, because they know what they're getting themselves into. I think I was pretty naive when I started, and things were different, right? So really having that context and understanding, and helping my supervisees talk about the 3 E's. So how is this event perceived as negative for you or your client? What are the lasting impacts or events from the consequences? And reminding myself as a supervisor, I was talking to someone this morning that, I've been in the field a long time. And so my tolerance to trauma is probably not like, I'm pretty desensitized to some things at this point. And that's not necessarily true for our supervisees. And I don't want it to be. Like, I don't think that's necessarily a good thing. But really acknowledging that, like, my tolerance to an event might not be the same as a new emerging therapist, or someone who has something in their trauma history, and there's a trauma echo coming up. Yeah. I also like to remind my supervisees, when we're talking about impact and experience and consequences, that a lot of this is happening like automatically. We're not maybe conscious of it. And so that education around the limbic system is helpful, and remembering that our supervisees have a nervous system as well, and reminding them of that, right? I like these slides. I use these images a lot with my supervisees to talk about when things are going well. How we know this is from the trauma resiliency model, that we are in our window of tolerance, our zone of resiliency, right? We use those terms as well. And having us track it, like, where are we this week? How are things going? How do we feel about this caseload that you just inherited? Like, what do you need support with? Because I don't want my supervisees to show up like this, right? Where they, one, are not telling me that they're here, or that they're stuck on low or stuck on high. And we know that in this field, there is a high turnover. In our agencies, we see that. We see our supervisees coming in and then leaving. And high turnover often, to me, tells me that there's something in the system that we're not doing well. And so what do we need to improve? And perhaps it is some trauma-informed supervision to keep people in the field longer, doing the work that they want to do well, and being well. And those are the kind of goals. So these are two images that I use with my supervisees to talk about clients, but also about themselves. How are things going? Where are we? What was going on this week? Tell me where you are in your nervous system. Even just that, like, let's do a nervous system check. How are things going in this moment? And even that ability to be asked that, I've noticed supervisees drop in and be like, oh, I didn't realize how tired I am. Like, I'm just going. And sometimes supervision is spending some time finding ways of supporting the supervisee. The cases will be there. Urgent things can come and go, and we can check in on urgent things, but maybe this time is more well spent on let's maybe create a practice for you on how you can take more breaks, or let's look at your caseload and see if there's anything we can do to, you're back to back. Like, when did you last use the bathroom? Right? Those kind of things that like new emerging therapists and seasoned ones often forget. I talked to them about our response to trauma, and I think those are a normal thing. Again, normalizing that these things are going to happen. And again, the piece that I want to come back to is why do these things happen? Why do our supervisees go into fight, flight, freeze, or fawn? Could be that they have some trauma echoes, right? Could be that they're in that place. We know that our population, there's a lot of trauma in our populations that we serve in this state, and within each little, microcosm of communities that we work in, that can vary. There could be some countertransference happening with our supervisees and having those conversations. We've done a couple of echoes here on countertransference. And those conversations are so important, and to know how to talk about it as a supervisor and what does it mean. And then high acuity of caseloads. How are we balancing our caseloads for our supervisees? If everybody has highly traumatized population, one after the other, and they're seeing 5 to 7 clients a day, how are they not getting secondary trauma? How are they not experiencing vicarious trauma? And so I think as organizations, if we have the ability to be able to have those conversations with leadership and say, we need to vary our caseloads, or we need to cut them lower. Like, we need to have, if someone has like really high acuity and trauma, they can't have 30 clients like that. There's no way. We'll lose people. And so that's, again, part of being trauma informed, is how do we advocate for change? And so, kind of wrapping up as we get close to the end, noticing if there's a chat, I haven't seen it, so I'm just going to keep going and end. It's right at the half hour. How we talk about caseloads, how we assign cases. Is it random? Is it mindful? Are we looking at case acuity? Can a supervisee say no? Like, I don't think I'm ready to do this. This is too close to home. I want more training around that. And how do we support current global parallel processes for our supervisees and our clients? And so these are kind of questions that I hold as a supervisor. And just some takeaways, being trauma informed includes our staff, includes our agencies, includes everybody who we're working with. We want emerging therapists to know that safety matters, and it's okay to have normal reactions to abnormal events. It's okay to have a reaction to something hard that you're hearing. It's okay to have support and ask for support. It's okay to cry, right? Those things are important, that we do that. We want the supervisees to know to come to us if they are in a fight, flight, freeze, or fawn place. We want them to remember that, like, we're here to support them, and this is ethical care. Bottom line, being trauma informed is ethical. So, kind of summarizing our conversation today, understanding trauma helps our supervisees, helps us as supervisors. Knowing our community is helpful. And remembering that living nervous system, we're one, right? Ours, our community, our supervisees. And ultimately, we want our supervisees to feel like they can come to us and build that trust, so that we can support their clients and support them. And again, that ethical care that's grounding us in our practice. So there's some of my references.